Welcome back to Market Institutions. This is the class on security of property. In the last class we talked about security of life, and we said that to create, to even begin to have economic activity beyond a very minimal level, you need to think about creating a viable state. We described the idea of dominance as fear or uncertainty created by one group for another group, and the Lockean idea that this is not compatible with liberty. Followed by the Hobbesian idea that when a state does not exist, you have your citizens living in continual fear and danger of violent death. We also described the great Leviathan in Hobbes's words as this creature that has its tentacles spread across the state, which is of course spread across the country, which is of course the state, and the Leviathan is sort of Hobbes's solution for getting out of the abysmal warlike situation of a stateless society. And so this was in line with this Weberian idea of the monopoly of violence that a state needs to create. But Asimoglu and Robinson had said that, in fact, that this idea of the state create sort of the Leviathan as being always positive for its citizens is unfounded, and they described the Janus-faced or the double-faced Leviathan as being a state that is both benevolent in the sense that it stops this constant violence and dominance of some groups over others, but also of becoming malevolent by creating sort of an autocratic system. And so they concern themselves with the question of how you create a balance of power between the state and society, and how do you shackle the Leviathan to remain within certain bounds. We're going to divide our discussion of security of property into two groups, into two sections. First, we'll talk about physical insecurity. And if you think about the institutional underpinnings of trade, we had described them as security of life, property and contract, but also information, as well as antitrust to keep competitive markets going, the control of rents, financial markets, quality assurance, and something that's not here really is a good bureaucratic system that creates more public or more efficient public goods. So to quote Hobbes, "Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man." So Hobbes is sort of championing this idea of the Leviathan here. "In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain." So now we're getting to Hobbes describing what will happen when the state is not playing its role. He's saying in such conditions there's no place for industry or for economic activity, because the fruit thereof is uncertain. And we will describe theoretical models in just a bit, sort of explaining why that uncertainty can be problematic. And consequently, no culture of the earth or no agriculture, no navigation nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. These famous words of Hobbes. So he's saying when you don't have a state creating certainty or creating circumstances in which trade can flourish, you will be left with very contracted economic activity, really nothing substantial happening, and lives will be miserable. And so we're going to take inspiration from Hobbes in this class, but we're going to expand this and formalize much more. So There are two types of insecurities in property. One is a physical insecurity, which we'll talk about today. For example, phone snatching, right? So you have property that gets snatched. It could be someone coming and doing qabza on your land. It could be someone stealing your property. And the other is legal insecurity, where the thing is in your possession, but whether you will continue to keep it legally or not is unclear. And this ties to this idea of unclear title or unclear registration of property. And we'll talk about this in the next section or the next class. So physical insecurity. What is the economic impact of physically insecure property? The first is that when you have physically insecure property, it decreases the marginal product of labor. If I know that when I do my effort, whatever I will produce might get stolen, that can decrease my willingness to put in that effort because I'm not going to get as much out of it anymore. The expected net present value of proposed investments can worsen. So again, if I'm going to invest, same as with labor, I invested my labor, what I got I can't hold on to. Similarly, I invest my capital, what I get I can't hold on to. And we'll come and talk about land later, but same concept applies. If you put a factor of production into play and whatever it produces is then not received by us, then you are left with fewer incentives to put those factors of production into play. Investments are not done on profit calculations alone, but also on the basis of security of property. So if you go and talk to farmers in the villages, sometimes they'll say the biggest reason that we don't invest in cattle is that cattle is hard to secure. But the crop that we're investing in, or if we're going and plying our trade outside, that is easier to, it's less movable. So there are more than optimal investments. So imagine that you have no insecurity. You have your optimal production and consumption bundles, as opposed to which now you've got insecurity, and that means that your effective payoff that you will take home is greater for assets that are harder to steal and slightly worse for assets that are easier to steal. And so you'll have a move away. So the marginal product of effort or investment in the easier to steal stuff is now falling. Marginal product in the other areas staying the same, but now you will see in equilibrium more investment in areas that are where assets are harder to steal and less investment in areas that are easier to steal. Furthermore, uncertainty reduces investments if capital is risk averse. So it's not just that things can get stolen, but because there is this risk, sometimes I will not have my item stolen, sometimes I will. That creates risk and uncertainty. People tend to be risk averse, and so there will be a further impact of this uncertainty on reducing investments in these areas. And so you also get suboptimal consumption, and the example of this is for anyone who's from Karachi. Typically my friends from Karachi tell me they don't, or hopefully things are better now, but at one point certainly they did not feel comfortable carrying a smartphone around. They carried cheaper phones when they were going in risky areas, and so that meant that they didn't, for example, have access to the apps that they needed or whatever. That's a very minor perhaps inconvenience, but it's a good example of how insecurity can cause suboptimal consumption. You can think of many more impactful sort of such suboptimalities also, but this is an example that perhaps most people will know. And the substitution of inputs to protection. So if let's say that you have 4 people working on your farm without any theft. Everyone works, everyone ends up producing. Whereas if you then have theft going around, you might say, let's have one of our people become a guard, full-time guard. And so that person is moved away from production to just protection. And this also creates, this means that there is less resource to actually produce stuff. And so that's another impact of having physically insecure property. And we'll talk about a lot of these things in more detail in a bit. So let's think about farming versus stealing. And so let's say that there are different farmers who can either grow corn or can gain corn by theft. Right? So you can actually grow, or you can go and steal. And if you can steal, then another person can also steal. And so you've got corn being lost to theft. And you've got your net consumption. So let's look at farmer A, who can grow 50 units of corn and can go around and steal well. So he gains 40 units from theft and ends up losing 10 units to someone else, and has final consumption of 50 grown himself, 40 stolen, minus 10, so 80 units of consumption at the end of the day. Similarly, farmer B is actually better at growing corn, so grows 150, but is worse at stealing, so can only gain 10 units. These are the 10 units that farmer A had lost. And so corn lost by B, hopefully you'll have guessed, is minus 40. And so B's total consumption is 120. So the total amount produced in the economy is 200, stolen by theft is 50, and lost to theft is 50, for net consumption of 200. Now, people will, once you have theft in play, people will start optimizing across three margins. They'll spend some effort or time in production, some in theft, and some in defending against theft. And remember that theft, as we just said a minute ago, theft and defense are zero-sum games. If you look at this table, the total corn grown and the total corn consumed is the same. And so all of this time spent on stealing and protecting is time that is lost in the aggregate. Right? The aggregate economy is not benefiting from this redistribution. And so these resources that are being spent and on making and then breaking security systems don't expand the goods and services available for consumption in the market. There are other impacts of general insecurity of both life and property. One is that there is less competition regionally, that there is, whether or not you're going to be able to compete is going to be determined not on the basis of economic calculations, but on the basis of insecurity or concerns of security. So think about real estate and think about what a plot in DHA goes for, and then think about a plot of land close to but outside the DHA. Then in most places you'll see that DHA gets a premium that is not explained by the quality of the services provided by the Defence Housing Authority in terms of, let's say, the road network and the wires and all of that. But instead, the reason that the plot goes for more is two things. One is more security within DHA, but more than that, more security of your plot. So if you go to sell your plot, it's very hard to create faulty paperwork or spurious paperwork and steal someone's property in DHA. And there, what we've done is we've created more secure property within the country. And the distinction between this and other places that's not accounted for by the potentially superior quality of services that DHA gives is the security premium on DHA property. And so if you think about it, this is where we need to think about the impact of having insecurity. Or to flip it, if we were able to create more security of property, properties outside DHA would also rise in value very significantly. The impact would be tremendous. The other area where insecurity can create problems is discoveries from discos or the power distribution companies. I was told by an influential government servant, we don't expect to get recoveries from the disco out in some remote area. And then the question is why? And what is the state's responsibility is to ensure writ over there. We've had people killed when they sort of line workers of distribution companies killed when they went to get when they went to recover bills in so-called hard areas, and this is of course a problem. So if we were able to fix security issues, one impact would be that we'd have less line losses for our electricity companies and our gas and so on. What if we were able to say there's going to be no theft? So you're going to have, no one is going to spend time on theft, and A and B are going to go back to producing more corn, and they produce 50 more units of corn each. If you take the status quo of what they could do with theft as a starting point, and I'm not going to get into why or why not that might be appropriate, you could start with their initial productions of 50 and 150. The point is that having this greater consumption will allow both to get more net consumption at the end of the day. And so here we are saying that farmer A and B, by not wasting their energies in aggregate, they weren't wasting their energies, but they were efficiently allocating energies in an inefficient system, right? They were privately efficient, but society was being inefficient. Now we're saying, let's for a second think, you're not going to spend your time on theft, instead go and work the farm a bit more, and so you're going to both produce more and we'll end up getting more. In order for this to work, the state has to create that monopoly on violence that we've talked about. Now, the question of whether that monopoly on violence is a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly is one where there's a tremendous fixed cost, but every unit after that is free, and so you can show that ultimately the market will be likely to be such that you will have only one player at the end of the day. Any one player that's an incumbent, as long as the technology remains the same, can set a price excuse me, that others don't have a chance of competing against and getting profit from. Is a natural monopoly on violence? So that's, some people think that there is a natural monopoly on violence, and there is a natural monopoly on violence if you think large scale enough. So it doesn't make sense for Pakistan to have 3 different armies, for example, for different parts of the country, because there is a virtue in coordination, and you can have the one army that is unified, able to create more power and project more power than 3 different armies that are not coordinating efforts. Similarly, if you think about guards, if imagine that every house needed its own guard because there was no one willing to look out for the next door neighbor's property, then you'd have one guard outside every door in the street. Well, typically people find that if you create access constraints in your lane, for example, by having a barrier or whatever, 1 or 2 guards is enough, because then they're able to coordinate, and if God forbid there's an attack, they can coordinate their efforts in dealing with that threat. And so that's the idea of natural monopoly on violence. Having said this, so how does the state create a circumstance in which theft is not individually efficient? So imagine, look at B. If A is now saying, yes, I'm going to not go and spend my time either protecting my property against theft or trying to steal from B. A goes and produces 130. Well, maybe B actually ends up spending less time in production and actually steals more. How do we create institutional circumstances in which A and B will both not have the incentive to steal? Is to create law enforcement, policing, and generally guarding against theft. And the theory goes that because law enforcement has the properties of a natural monopoly, that over time a state will emerge. Whether or not this is true is hotly debated. So what we've tried to say in this lecture is that security of life is important, but so is security of property. The more secure your property is, the more you will have people willing to invest in productive efforts, and the more people invest in productive efforts, of course, you as a society can flourish more. A simple concept, of course, but when we start thinking about economics, sometimes we're in such a rush to go to our models and applying those models that we sometimes perhaps forget the importance of security of property as an underpinning of the economy. In the next lecture, we will talk about legal insecurity of property, and that we'll be able to sort of also give you more examples, and it's a fun conversation. I'm looking forward to. See you there. In the next lecture, we will talk about legal insecurity of property, and that we'll be able to sort of also give you more examples, and it's a fun conversation. I'm looking forward to. See you there.